Hello, everyone. Welcome to PCAP's last Native Prairie Speaker Series for 2025. My name is Caitlin Rose-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Emma Blanken, a recent Master of Science in Biology graduate from the University of Regina, will be speaking about intersexual differences in Roost-site use by little Brown Myotis in Cypress Hills, Saskatchewan. But before we get started, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they've worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. I'm delighted to let everyone know that even though this is our last webinar for 2025, we have some awesome webinars coming up this winter. In January, we'll have Kelsey Freitag speak about long-billed curlews in North America. And in February, the Ministry of Environment will talk about their recent research regarding swift fox in southern Saskatchewan. And you can check out the PCAP website to register for upcoming webinars. And just a reminder to our listeners out there, as we've got over 200 people registered for the webinar, you'll be muted for the duration of the presentation. But if you have any questions at all during the presentation, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar has been provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Pembina, Saskatchewan Cattle Association, and SaskTel. Our supporting sponsors are the Innovation Credit Union and Rancher Stewardship Alliance, Inc. And in-kind support has been provided by the University of Regina. And so with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. So Emma Blanken earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Colorado, Boulder, where she triple majored in ecology and evolutionary biology, English, and psychology. She moved to Regina to complete her Master's of Science in Biology at the University of Regina. And after finishing her degree, she worked with the Nature Conservancy of Canada before returning to Colorado, where she now works with Boulder County Parks and Open Space. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Emma.
Here, thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to me talk about my research. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Here we go. I hope everybody can see that. I cannot see you, so if I start doing anything weird or if anything weird starts happening, please give me a shout and let me know. Today I'm going to be talking about my master's research, which looked at the intersexual differences between males and non-reproductive females in their Roost-site use in Cypress Hills, Saskatchewan. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'm sure a lot of us here have some understanding, some awareness of the importance of habitats for the animals that reside within them. Habitats provide important resources like food, shelter, reproductive opportunities, and these individuals require these resources to engage in important processes like foraging, rest, energy conservation, reproduction, things like that. So individuals are pressured to choose high quality habitats because the quality of these habitats and the resources that they provide can better maximize an individual's chances of survival, of reproduction, and thus their overall fitness. So understanding the variables that affect habitat use, like the characteristics of resources within an environment, can better help us understand how specific resources and how animals use these resources relate to their life cycle strategies and their needs during these times. So some examples of this happening in Eastern Canada and in the world around us are porcupines, who choose mixed forests with a high proportion of aspen trees because they're an important food resource. In Colorado, which is where I'm calling from, broad-tailed hummingbirds often choose conifer trees to roost under during the night because they're more thermally stable and they help them engage in thermoregulatory processes. Obviously, much more animals engaged in habitat selection and resource use than the ones that I talked about, but we're here to talk about bats, so let's kind of shift our focus there. There are over 1,400 species of bat in the world. They're an incredibly widespread animal. They make up about a quarter of all mammal species. They're the only mammal capable of true flight, and they're found in every continent except Antarctica. So from that information, we can kind of gather that bats use a variety of different habitats. They rely on a lot of different resources and sites for their roosts. Roosts are structures that bats use to conserve energy, to raise their young, for protection from weather and predators. They're incredibly important spaces for energy conservation, for juvenile development, things like that. So there are over 150 species of bat alone in North America. That's including Mexico as well. And some have very specific habitat and roosting requirements, like the migratory hoary bat, which is frequently found roosting beneath tree foliage, often needles and conifer trees, as these, much like the hummingbird I mentioned, allow them to better engage in thermoregulatory processes. The little brown bat, which is pictured on the right, um, am I right? At least, is a species of bat that is more considered more of a generalist. They are able to roost in a variety of structures and don't necessarily rely on one site um, to better promote their energy conservation and fitness. So the little brown bat is one of the most widespread species of bat in North America, and this is partly due to the variety of roosts that it's able to occupy. Um, a lot of other bats have more centralized ranges, but because the little brown bat is able to roost in structures like buildings, trees, rock crevices, their range is much more extended northern and southern. So the little brown bat, like I mentioned, is generally a generalist species, and they're most frequently found in buildings. The little brown bat and the big brown bat have fairly comparable roosting preferences, and they're often grouped and categorized together because they are able to roost in buildings. After the Industrial Revolution, so the species little brown bats and big brown bats evolved using tree cavities because they're well protected, they're warm, they provide protection from predators and weather. They're really excellent roost sites. So after the Industrial Revolution, when the availability of these trees became more limited and buildings started popping up everywhere, the buildings that mimicked these tree cavities were structures that big brown bats and little brown bats evolved to start using. Um, Now, after the Industrial Revolution, these species of bat are associated with using buildings in areas where elevations are high, temperatures are not suitable year round, and summers are short. Reproductive females also often form maternity colonies, which are groups of reproductive females who gather to raise their young in buildings because, again, they're well protected from predators. They're thermally stable and often warmer than the surrounding environment, which promotes juvenile development. And they're just really excellent roost sites for these reproductive processes. So the picture on the left is a picture of little brown bats in a maternity colony in a building, and the picture on the right is a picture of big brown bats in a maternity colony also in a building. So I mentioned that little brown bats evolved using structures that are more natural, and again, this is commonly tree cavities. Um, Throughout their geographic range, the species of tree that little brown bats use for their cavities often changes based on availability. But again, cavities are well protected, they're thermally stable, they're great roost sites for multiple individuals to roost within. Other structures that you may be able to find them in are occasionally under tree foliage and needles, like the hoary bat and the broad-tailed hummingbird that I mentioned. Rock crevices are also a common structure. And then in the winter, these little brown bats also occupy caves. And the reason why bats occupy caves in the winter is because they're typically cooler, again, they're thermally stable, and they allow individuals to enter hibernation more deeply. Hibernation is a strategy that little brown bats employ when food reserves are very high, when water isn't available. And rather than hunting during a time where insects aren't available, they rely on their conserved fat, their conserved energy to lower their metabolic rate, um, and sort of sleep throughout the winter. So while the little brown bat is one of the most widespread species in North America, they are also being absolutely decimated. They are currently endangered in Canada, and I believe under review in the United States. And this is due to a fungus called white nose syndrome. This is a fungus that wipes out almost up to 100% of hibernating populations of little brown bats in some regions. And the way that it does this is by eating away at the keratin on their nose, their wings, and their muzzles. And this process disturbs the bats to the point where they wake up during the winter and with no food or water to replenish these fat reserves that they use to wake up, which is a very costly process, they eventually starve to death. So you might be wondering why I'm looking at summer roosts when winter roosts are really what we're interested, or when winter is really when this fat is being affected and pressured. And the reason is because summer roosts can largely affect what happens in the winter, and success in the summer can affect what happens in the winter. So better protecting and promoting roosts that promote energy conservation, that promote rapid juvenile development, and factors like that can better employ success for the species in the winter. So most research that looks at little brown bat roost use identifies buildings as the primary site they use. This makes sense because of what I said previously. They're pretty excellent roost sites in terms of their protection and their ability to be thermally stable. But most research also primarily looks at reproductive females. And this makes sense because reproductive females are a valuable group of individuals to study. They're contributing to the genetic diversity of populations, population stability. They do need to be studied and protected. But we know where they're roosting in Cypress Hills. In Cypress Hills, there's a group, an aggregation of reproductive females who form a maternity colony in these two buildings, the brown one, the white one, and that bat box. And this has been going on for years before I started my research, so it's a pretty well-established colony. When non-reproductive females and males are included in the mix, however, is when we start to see roost use become a bit more variable. And this also makes sense because these individuals aren't pressured to return to the same site to nurse and raise their young. And as such, they can choose sites that do not include the maternity colony and can be trees, rock crevices, and more natural. And these are also a valuable group of individuals to study. Just because they're not reproductive right now does not mean that for non-reproductive females, they won't be in the future. Bats mate in the fall, and then females store the sperm throughout the winter into the spring. And so better supporting individuals in the summer can better promote reproductive success for males and females in the fall, throughout the winter, into the ongoing reproductive season. So this leads me to my research questions, which are essentially what roosts are non-reproductive females and males using in Cypress Hills, and how do these roosts differ from the surrounding available environment? My next question is if non-reproductive females and males are roosting differently, and if so, how is this difference characterized? So to answer these questions, the first thing I had to do is go to Cypress Hills. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. It is a really incredible place to work and study bats. It's an interprovincial park. It's between Saskatchewan and also Alberta. I worked in the West Block, which borders again Saskatchewan and Alberta, but on the eastern side of the West Block, which is on the Saskatchewan side. So in the West Block of Cypress Hills, I worked on the eastern portion. And again, Cypress Hills is a really cool spot. It rises about 600 meters above the surrounding prairies, which creates a relatively high elevation of environment compared to the surrounding environment. This creates incredible habitat diversity, containing mixes of lakes and wetlands, native prairie grasslands, and mixed forests. And most importantly for me, there are very few buildings and anthropogenic influence, meaning it's a pretty great spot to study the natural roost use of the species, which is what I'm really interested in. So I mentioned a mixed forest, so I just want to talk about that a little bit. This is an image that I pulled from a study that used drones to characterize and define the composition of the West Block of Cypress Hills. Again, I worked in the eastern portion. And what we can see here is that the forest is composed of 32% pine, 42% spruce, and 26% aspen. This was found in the paper. And so what I want to mention here is that if bats are just choosing a tree because it's available, because it's a tree and it's there, and they can roost in it, we would expect roost use to follow a pretty similar proportion. So out of 10 trees, we'd expect roughly 3 aspen, 3 pine, and 4 spruce to kind of mimic that ratio. So I just want us to keep that in mind because this will come into play in the future. The next thing I had to do was catch bats. And my team and I did this primarily over Battle Creek. Battle Creek is a creek that runs through the West Block of Cypress Hills. And that's kind of uses as a highway in the area. Either it's very open and it's composed of forests on both sides, kind of closing it in. And this makes it an excellent foraging area and also a great commuting pathway to get to other foraging areas. So we caught a really high number of bats using this method. Saskatchewan is home to 8 bat species, so I do want to highlight the other species of bat that we caught and worked with. The eastern red bat, silver-haired bat, and the hoary bat are bats that are migratory, that don't spend their winters in Saskatchewan or around Saskatchewan, but do come back during the summer. The big brown bat and the little brown bat are more locally migratory species, and they stay in or around Saskatchewan to hibernate during the winter. So after I caught bats, took various measurements and such, I fixed them with a radio transmitter, and I did this again only for males and non-reproductive females. Um, and in case you're wondering how radio tracking works, how I actually identified the roost that they were roosting in, I'm going to tell you, and it works a lot like a car radio. So when you're listening to music, listening to the radio in your car, there's a radio station that emits a signal that you then tune in with a dial to pick up. In my case, my radio station is the radio transmitter on the back of a bat that emits a specific signal that I'm then able to tune into my receiver. And the receiver starts picking up this signal, but much like the internal antenna, the external antenna on the outside of your car, this handheld antenna that I'm holding here allows me to amplify the signal and also directionally orient myself to where that bat may be. Um, Radio tracking also has a thing called gain, which is how hard the receiver is working to pick up your signal. Mine was anywhere from 1 to 16. 16 is it's working incredibly hard, it's working overtime. It's at 60 hours a week, it's tired, and it's trying to find that signal. So when you turn in a circle 360 degrees, you're likely to hear that signal in all 360 degrees. Whereas if I were to turn that signal down to 8 or 6 and then again turn in the same circle, I'd likely only hear the signal to about 180 or 90 degrees. And that allows me to then bring the gain down to 1 and find a bat in an entire tree of an entire forest of trees. Like that's like what's behind me in that picture. So once I identified a tree or a roost structure in general, I characterized it. First thing I did was identify whether it was a building or a tree species. I expected most individuals to be roosting in trees, though I did anticipate non-reproductive females to switch between the maternity colony and natural structures. We'll talk about that a bit later. But in terms of tree species, what I was expecting individuals to use were aspen trees. Aspen trees form cavities in a way that white spruce and pine trees don't as frequently. White spruce and pine trees do form cavities, but aspen trees, through decay, rot, lightning strike, breakage, external excavators, factors like that, typically have cavities much more frequently and commonly. Aspen trees are also a structure of tree that little browns have been found using in other areas, so they're definitely a viable structure. And big brown bats have also been found using them in Cypress Hills, and since they have pretty comparable roosting preferences, it follows that little browns might also be in aspens. I also measure diameter of breast height and the height of the tree. Taller trees are typically warmer, and also wider trees are typically warmer. And for reproductive individuals, for reproductive females, warmth is really important because it allows rapid juvenile development. But for non-reproductive individuals, this might not be, and it is not as much of a concern. And so as such, I expected them to be roosting in cooler roosts in trees that were smaller in diameter at breast height and shorter as well. And the reason for this is because they get less sun exposure, they're typically cooler, and that cooler microclimate allows bats to enter torpor, which is a shallow form of hibernation, more deeply. And employing torpor can help bats when weather is inclement, when it would be a waste of energy to leave the roost to hunt for insects that aren't there. And rather than wasting energy doing that process, they can enter torpor, remain in the roost, and not waste energy looking for insects that aren't there when weather is poor. I also expected individuals to be roosting in dead or declining trees, so essentially a stage 2 to about a stage 6. These trees, regardless of species, typically indicate the presence of cavities, whereas live trees, again, do not. To compare used trees against available trees to characterize the surrounding environment, I walked in each cardinal direction in a random distance, selected a tree that met my height and diameter criteria. Essentially, it could not be a sapling. Species didn't really matter, so I was measuring spruce and aspen. Pine weren't really in the stands that I was looking at, but species did not matter. Um, and then also I measured condition and all the other characteristics for those available trees. I also took the temperature measurements of roost trees because I wanted to verify whether or not individuals were roosting and indeed cooler roosts. So we took a tree climbing class with Arboriculture Canada. That's me up way up in a spruce tree there. It was a really, really cool learning opportunity. And we measured the temperature of occupied trees and available trees. But we only ended up being able to do this for male roost trees, and we only ended up measuring 3 trees out of those male roost trees. And the reason for this is because tree climbing is pretty difficult. It's a pretty tedious process in order to do it safely. And to do it safely takes some time and a lot of equipment. It requires shooting a weighted rope into the perfect nook of a branch in a tree, tying a rope to that weighted rope, pulling it into the tree, and then tying up a pretty complicated knot system to be able to get up there and affix your temperature sensor. And then we had to do this all over again for an available tree. Ended up taking us roughly about a day per measurement that we were doing. So it was a pretty long time. And in terms of the amount of equipment, we weren't able to cart that into the roost that females were using because they were just way too far off the beaten path, and it would have been kilometers of hiking, and it just wouldn't have been very feasible. So we only ended up measuring male roost trees. So bats switch roosts, and this is where the intersexual variation really comes in. Bats switch roosts for a number of reasons: infection mitigation, resource availability, climate, socialization, probably a lot of other factors. And so I expected both males and non-reproductive females to be employing this process. But males I anticipated to switch between aspen structures. They are typically not included in maternity colonies. They don't really have a reason to be there. Um, so I did not expect them to be switching to that structure. But I did anticipate them to be taking advantage of the properties of using various aspen trees. In terms of non-reproductive females, I did expect them to be roosting and switching between the maternity colony and available aspen trees. And the reason for this is because they can take advantage of the resources that both structures provide. Maternity colonies, again, very well protected, thermally stable, and there's a lot of females in them. So non-reproductive individuals can socialize. They can also potentially indirectly boost their fitness by supporting related individuals in raising their young. And this has been observed in other bat species. So there's reasons for them to be in the maternity colony that don't only relate to it being a pretty fantastic roost. When the maternity colony gets too warm, to mitigate infection, to employ other thermoregulatory processes, non-reproductive females are able to also switch to natural structures, which is why I expected them to also be in aspen trees. So let's kind of get into some of my results. I tagged 30 individuals, and I was able to find the roosts of 10 females and 9 males. Since batch switch roosts from these 19 individuals, I did find 25 roost sites, but I did lose 11 bats. And you might be wondering why that is. And the reason why I lost 11 bats is because the forest in Cypress Hills is very dense. There has not been a fire that has come through this area in decades, and this is definitely shown in the undergrowth of the forest and in like just the thickness of what you're walking through. So there were times where we would be tracking a bat, and we would get down to a gain of 5 or 6. Could almost picture the tree that they were in, like what happened to me in that bottom left picture, and then just couldn't get there because of the thickness of the forest. There were times where we would walk for 10 kilometers and never pick up a signal. Yeah. And also, I don't recommend this glue, especially during the first year. We had some issues with transmitters staying on, making it so that I wasn't able to identify roost switching to the degree I would have liked. And so yes, I would recommend using a glue that is different from this one. There were also times where I would tag a bat and just never hear the signal again. We would track them for weeks and just never pick up the signal. Or my favorite thing that would happen is when we would be tracking them. And one of my coworkers, who I think might be here, Siobhan, was tracking bats at night to identify their foraging behavior and better characterize that. So my favorite thing that would happen is when I couldn't pick up a signal during the day, but then Siobhan would hear it at night. So we knew that they were flying around, but I just couldn't find their roost, which was incredibly frustrating. So from the 19 individuals that I tagged, like I said, I was able to identify 25 roosts from those individuals. And what I really want to emphasize here is that the majority of males and the majority of male roosts that I found were in natural structures, whereas the primarily female roost that I identified was in an anthropogenic site. So let's talk about that anthropogenic site. It was the maternity colony, which is interesting because, as I mentioned before, they do have reasons and beneficial reasons to be in this colony, but it doesn't necessarily follow with what their needs are during the season. Non-reproductive females don't need to return to nurse their young. They don't necessarily have a reason to be returning to this maternity colony. So it brings to light questions like inclusive fitness, like supporting genetically related individuals, engaging in clustering behavior to keep naked pups warm, or the fact that, again, this is a really fantastic roost site that may be allowing these females to engage in better thermoregulatory processes. So I want to talk about some roost switching, which is really where the sort of distinct requirements of individuals within the groups that I was studying kind of come into play and really, I think, are highlighted. So we named a lot of our bats. This is Chloe, kind of help us keep track of who we were tracking during which week. So this is Chloe. And we tracked Chloe. We had her signal for 5 days. And every night, or every day, I suppose, she alternated between the maternity colony and the stand of trees off of the base of a cliff, which, for obvious reasons, though I did try extremely hard to find that roost, we did not end up ever getting to it. So if on Monday, Chloe was found in the maternity colony, on Tuesday, she was located in the stand of trees off the cliff, and then on Wednesday, she was back in the colony. This is Pond, another bat who we named. And she was identified roosting in a live spruce before I lost her signal for a day. And then she popped up again the third day in the maternity colony. And this is Microwave, who, rather than switching from a natural roost to the maternity colony, remained in the structure for the entire length of time that we were tracking her. She first was in that brown barn for 3 days, then switched to that bat box for 1 day, and then was identified in the white barn beside the brown barn for the next 3 days. So let's characterize and talk about male anthropogenic roost sites, because while I did not expect them to be using buildings, there were a couple who did. And that was Josh and Carlo. So Josh is the individual to the far left who is roosting in the building below him. The one on the right-hand side with only one window is where I found Josh. Males typically roost alone during the summer. They have sometimes been found in bachelor colonies, groups of small males, but most frequently they are identified roosting solitarily. And when I did an exit count, which is where you essentially sit outside a structure and watch bats leave it, we saw Josh leaving, and he was the only bat leaving the structure, which follows previous research. But Carlo, who was actually a recapture from a couple of weeks prior, and so when we captured him a second time, I said, "Sorry, Carlo, I'm tagging you and I'm finding where you're going." And he was found roosting in this building in the top right-hand side. And when we did an exit count there, he left with 14 other individuals, which is pretty surprising considering males do form bachelor colonies, but it isn't very frequent. So let's talk about natural roosts, which is really what I was interested in characterizing and really wanted to focus my work on. And I found 16 natural roosts between males and females that they were roosting in. The majority of these roost sites, 15 of them, were in white spruce trees of varying conditions, heights, structures, all of those factors. But every bat has to be different. So when we talk about some roost switching and some notable roost switching for natural structures, I have to bring up Reginald. Reginald was one of our most successful tracks. We tracked him for over 2 weeks and never lost the signal. It was really fantastic, and I really do remember him quite fondly. And Reginald was initially roosting in this first white spruce on the left-hand side, remained there for roughly 5 days, and then switched to this white spruce in the same stand of trees, roughly about a kilometer away, where he remained for roughly 3 days. After this, I was kind of expecting not to be able to find Reginald anymore. This was kind of the length of time that we had tracked bats for. So I wasn't really expecting to pick up the signal anymore after that. But the fall after 3 days, Reginald decided to roost in this aspen tree directly beside that original spruce. Um, and this is quite interesting because at this point, we had been finding bats in spruce trees. We were really expecting to keep finding bats in spruce trees. Not to say that aspen trees weren't available because we were measuring them for our comparison trees, but to actually find a bat roosting in an aspen tree really exemplifies that species, while important, does not always provide the microclimate conditions that might be necessary based on environmental conditions or physiological restraints or what have you. Um, Reginald remained roosting in this aspen tree for about 3 days before he switched to a spruce tree almost in the valley directly across from the original stand of trees, where he remained for the remainder of the time we were tracking him. And I eventually picked up the transmitter that had fallen off his back, which had never happened before. So that was really cool and exciting for me. Um, and this is Brownie, who again is another notable roost switcher, largely because he remained roosting in a spruce tree above a cougar cache for about 3 days, making it really fun and kind of spooky to go back and verify that he was still in that tree. Um, and then after about 3 days, Brownie switched to a spruce snag, again, less than a kilometer away from the original tree, and then switched to another spruce snag in the same picture. And what I really want to emphasize here is that while I was looking at specific roost characteristics and why individuals might be choosing one tree over another tree, I think stand characteristics are also something that really needs to be considered. Why are individuals roosting in one group of tree versus another group of trees across the forest? So I think Brownie and Reginald really exemplify the necessity to be considering that. All right, so let's get to some of my findings. I ran a generalized linear model, and what this model does is it essentially it estimates the likelihood that a bat will be found in a tree, looking at each characteristic that I measured and keeping all other features constant. And it does this by comparing the trees to available trees that I measured. And let's talk about tree species because while my model didn't really find any significance in where bats are more likely to roost, there were some really strong suggestions that might be supporting where they are choosing. And what I found is that spruce do have a higher odds of being occupied by a bat, male or non-reproductive female, and they have a higher odds when compared to aspen. This is not to say that aspen trees aren't important because we did see Reginald roosting in an aspen tree and spruce trees, but spruce may be providing better conditions and resources for individuals during this time. And this finding is supported by the composition of the forest. So I said that this map would be coming back, and it is. And what I really want to exemplify here is that I found 94% of the trees that bats were roosting in were in white spruce, whereas white spruce only make up about 42% of the environment. So when you're considering if bats are choosing a tree more than what's available in the environment, we can see that they are because 94% of the roosts were in spruce. And if bats were choosing trees just because they're there and available, we would expect this use to look something more like 7 out of 16 trees being in white spruce and the rest being spread across aspen and pine. All right, so let's get into some male findings. Again, none of my model didn't really suggest that anything was significant, but there were some strong indications that might be influencing their roost use. On average, occupied trees were dead versus declining. They were shorter than available trees, and they were also wider in diameter. My model suggested that taller trees do have a lower likelihood of being occupied by males than shorter trees. So shorter trees are more likely to be found with a male roosting within them. And my microclimate measurements did also support this finding that males might be roosting in cooler trees. Two out of the trees that I did measure, 2 out of the 3 trees that I did measure were significantly cooler than their available counterparts. Um, and while this isn't a very large sample size, I do think it suggests that further research may need to be done here. Um, Something that I do want to mention here is that while little browns, maybe male little browns may be roosting in cooler trees, the fungus that causes white nose syndrome is also a cold loving fungus, and it can persist in the environment for years. So, what this means is that when bats are leaving a white nose infected cave and returning to cooler roosts in the summer, they may be serving as vectors for this fungus throughout a period where it shouldn't be persisting in the environment. Similar findings have been suggested for little browns who are roosting in rock crevices in Colorado. So, I do think this is something that should be considered in future research. All right, so let's get to some female findings. All 4 of the trees that I found females in, which aren't very many, but they were all in white spruce. So I think this does suggest that white spruce may be a valuable resource for roosting. And available trees, occupied trees that I measured were alive versus available declining. They were taller and they were also wider in diameter at breast height. So, what does this mean when considering the roost selection and the roost use of non reproductive females and males in Cypress Hills? Well, spruce trees are a structure that they share in common, but this is kind of where the similarities end. Males are seen to be using cooler roosts that are shorter than the surrounding environment, which may be allowing them to enter torpor more deeply, less interrupted during times when inclement weather and insect availability are not high. Females, on the other hand, are roosting in alive trees that do not indicate the presence of cavities. And for a cavity roosting species, this is quite interesting. It suggests that females may be roosting beneath tree foliage under needles, much like the hoary bat and the broad-tailed hummingbird. And I do think this needs to be further looked at and considered. It also suggests that heat and sun exposure may be coming into play, and this is supported by their fidelity to the maternity colony. Maternity colonies, again, typically warmer, there's more individuals, they're hotter, promote juvenile development. And so these warm roosting microclimates may be supporting non reproductive females in preparing for reproduction for the fall. They also may be supporting genetically related individuals, engaging in inclusive fitness, and I do think this needs to be considered. What this means for forest management. Spruce trees are important, but I will say it's unrealistic to try to preserve every single spruce tree in an environment, especially in a forest that is as due for a fire and due for management as the one in Cypress Hills is. Bats switch roosts frequently. The individuals that I was tracking switched roosts on average roughly every 2 days, which follows previous research. And what this suggests is that as conditions change, environmental factors, and physiological restraints, the roost that might have supported a bat 2 days ago might not be the roost that these individuals require 2 days from then. And so what this means is that looking at factors like stand composition, forest composition, and other reasons why bats might be selecting a stand of trees over a specific tree might help us better support the requirements of this species. When considering little brown bats, um, preserving snags may be supporting this group as a whole, but you may be better supporting males, for example. And while non reproductive females can likely use these roosts to support their processes, they might not be what's preferred. So, providing a mosaic of roosts, providing lots of options, can better ensure that we are promoting and preserving all of the groups within the species males, non reproductive females alike. All have different roosting requirements that are a bit more nuanced than the general roosting requirements of this species. And so, again, I just want to highlight that protecting the more nuanced roosting capabilities of the species can better promote success for individuals regardless and including condition. All right, well, thank you. I believe that's it. Thank you to my funders, to PCAP for the opportunity, to everyone who helped with the research. There is a QR code in the bottom left that you can scan to read my paper that probably says everything a lot more eloquently than I did. And also feel free to email me if you have any questions that are not answered during our question period. Um, and I think that's it.
Awesome. Well,
So
thank
I
you
am
so
going
much for
to,
thank you so much for sharing your enthusiasm and your passion and all of your knowledge with us. I bet your family and friends thought you were crazy when you were talking about Reginald and Josh and Carlos.
oh, yeah, it was the names that I was spouting out were a bit impressive for sure.
How did you come up with the names?
We just had different, whoever was working with us that day, we would either pick a theme or we would pick a mood or something, and we would just name our bats based on that. Sometimes someone would just shout a random name and we'd say, okay, that's it.
That makes sense. It's probably better than the brown one. I mean, the other brown one. I mean, the little brown one. Like, right.
Exactly. It was a lot easier to think of them as kind of like entities that you were tracking rather than just a number.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So we've got a few questions in already. To our attendees, if you have any questions, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard, and you can also upvote other people's questions if you have the same one. So we have a couple questions about uh, kind of the females. So did you find any maternity roosts?
No, the only maternity roost that I identified was the one that has been there for years before I started my research. So that was the one consisting of the few barns and the bat box. I did like I tracked reproductive, non-reproductive females to that roost, so I found it in a way, but we already knew it was there, so that was the only one that I identified.
Okay. Um, and why were there some non-breeding females?
Yeah, so non-reproductive females can be non-reproductive for a number of reasons. Age is a big factor, and then also the stress of the winter. So I mentioned that better supporting non-reproductive females may better increase their chances of mating in the fall and then also storing that sperm over the winter and becoming pregnant in the spring. And due to harsher winters, due to white nose infected winters and factors like that, non reproductive females may be facing too many other pressures to spend the energy developing and raising young.
Okay, thanks for that answer. An attendee named Erica is wondering, did you look at the type of crevices occupied?
Um, we we really would have liked to. For a lot of the trees that we identified that had crevices, well, trees that have crevices are not safe to climb. So A, we couldn't get up there to see the crevices. And then they were so tall that we couldn't even really like. A lot of them were tall and broken off and on the top, and so you couldn't get up there to peer in. So while we could see with some trees that they had cavities or were very much alive and didn't, we weren't really able to assess the characteristics of them.
Okay. Did you do a lot of tree climbing during your research?
We did. We spent a couple of weeks taking a class to learn it and then ended up doing it for a few trees. But I did learn that, like, you could spend an entire research project just climbing trees and measuring the temperatures. So, doing that along with tracking bats, we either needed more time or more people.
Makes sense. And we have an attendee wondering about, do you know what species of trees, other species of bats in the area were roosting in? Just curious, if there's multiple bat species all seeking to roost in white spruce.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and is definitely probably the case. There are silver-haired bats that frequently are roosting in aspen trees, actually, and then big brown bats also are roosting in aspen trees in the area. Hoary bats are the guys that are roosting under conifer branches, probably because they're warmer, they have sun exposure, so when they're in torpor, they can use that ambient sunlight to kind of help them wake up with the sun. Um, and so in terms of them sharing and occupying spaces with other bats, I would say hoary bats are the ones that they were probably working with.
Okay, interesting. I love interspecies connections. And another attendee is wondering, what reasons might the bats have for changing their roost? Did you have any theories on that? Could it be avoiding predators?
Yeah, so bats change roosts for a number of reasons. I do think infection mitigation and disease control is a factor playing here because when bats roost in really big colonies, there are insects like bat bugs and pests like those that can spread really easily. And so switching to another more solitary roost kind of allows them to not be as pressured by that. Switching to roost can also be closer to foraging sites. So rather than flying multiple kilometers to get to different areas, you're a lot closer and more localized. And then also different thermoclimate conditions. So what makes a tree really good for the first few days, either because of sun exposure, lack thereof, factors like that, with changing environmental conditions might mean that that tree is not as preferable a few days from then.
Okay, that makes sense. Um, and earlier we were talking that you'd saw some cougars while you were in Cypress Hills. Is that right?
Yeah.
Would they be a predator for bats, or they're not interested in them? They're interested in something bigger, do you think?
No, they're definitely interested in something bigger. I would say the predators that bats are mostly concerned with in the Cypress Hills would be owls and raptors, and species like that. Snakes are also a pretty common, pressure and predator that bats are facing, raccoons, things like that. But cougars, I would say bats are just way too much work to catch, and it's just not worth the energy.
Absolutely. We have a few more questions coming in here. Um, were you able to determine where the bat was positioned on a spruce tree? Like, was it on the trunk, along the branch, under the bark? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, this is something that has haunted me for a while, and I the answer is no. When we identified a tree, we used some thermal imaging. We used a lot of different sort of strategies to see where these guys might be roosting, and just never were able to. So if they were, my theory is that they were either within cavities or under bark or very nestled sort of branches that we weren't able to observe. But and we also couldn't climb trees while bats were in them. So if I tracked a bat to a tree, I would wait until it left that tree to then test the microclimate. So it's not like I could get up there and like see where they were. So that's definitely something that I'm interested in. My thoughts are that males were in cavities and females were roosting under needles. Um, but it isn't something I observed. It's just a hypothesis.
Okay. And an attendee named Jessica is wondering, given the difficulty associated with climbing and measuring trees, would you change anything in your survey design?
Yeah, I looking back, I do think, looking at microclimate, it did provide some really valuable data that I do think future researchers could use to inform some of their projects. So I won't say it was a waste of time or non-beneficial for those reasons, but looking back, I probably would have focused more on tracking bats and identifying their roosts rather than spending time and a lot of time climbing these trees and getting the microclimate conditions.
Okay, that makes sense. And Cameron's wondering if you found any roosts in balsam poplar or river birch.
No, balsam poplar and river birch, from what I observed and as far as I know, are not in the west block of Cypress Hills. And if
Okay.
they are, they're in very small, minimal numbers. So the only aspen species that I found individuals roosting in were trembling aspen, but no other groups.
Okay. Okay,
Mhm.
perfect. And we have a few questions kind of related to anthropogenic structures.
Yeah.
Megan is wondering, would you say anthropogenic structures are required for maternal colonies?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question that some other research has kind of looked at and suggested that they are sort of a limiting factor for the species as a whole, but also for reproductive individuals. Um, and I agree with that somewhat. I think with a species that is so currently pressured by other factors that aren't that are habitat availability, but also are disease, being able to better promote and preserve whatever structures they're using, whether they're buildings or trees, is a great way to support this species. If that maternity colony were for whatever reason to become unavailable, do I think that these bats would be able to switch to another viable structure? Yes. But I do think that this would cause an incredible amount of stress. Um, and these individuals likely wouldn't be as successful as reproducing as they were in their original site.
Okay. And Bill is wondering, is it worth putting up bat houses in yards?
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to try to promote habitat for these species, especially if, in the summer when you're sitting outside and you see bats flying around, if you're by a source of water, open fields, things like that. Bat boxes are a really excellent way to try to promote um, habitat use for this species. Even if you set up a bat box and it's only used very ephemerally, even for a couple hours in a night or things like that, in between foraging bouts, it's still a way to support the energetic processes and other processes for bats. So I would definitely say bat boxes are a good thing.
Okay, awesome. And Susan's wondering if you can provide any details about forestry management guidelines to better support female roosting sites.
Yeah, I think when considering forestry management guidelines, a lot of papers, mine included, suggest maintaining a mosaic and a wide variety of roosts. And I do think the little brown bat perfectly characterizes and sort of emphasizes the importance of that, because where you find them during one day might not be where you find them in a couple of days. For non-reproductive individuals and reproductive females that I found, I only found a few natural roosts that they were using only four. But I will say that looking at heat retention, looking at energy properties and things like that, and understanding that having tall trees, short trees, snags, live trees, factors like that can better support whatever is needed based on whatever physiological restraint, environmental conditions, factors like that, so that they can switch between them. So, in terms of a specific structure or a specific species to preserve, I don't think that there's an answer to that. I think it's really preserving the diversity, the equalness and richness of your forests.
Okay, great answer. Thanks. And Carol's wondering, would you say that bats prefer pines and spruce in general? Um, can or is it specific to each species?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty specific to each species and pretty specific to geographic region and availability as well. So just because you find a little brown bat roosting in a white spruce in Cypress Hills does not mean that if you were to go to BC or Alberta or different areas, they wouldn't be roosting in a different species. So rather than considering if it's tree species, that's what really is important, I would go further than that and consider what are these species providing? Is it microclimate? Is it the availability of cavities, needles for them or leaves for them to roost under, exfoliating bark? Um, and the tree species in an area can often suggest whether that's happening, but it's not the species itself.
Okay, that makes sense. And David is wondering, were your transmitters attached only with glue, or did you have like underskin anchors or anything like that?
No, they were only attached with glue. One of my coworkers, Louisa from Germany, she actually brought a really good glue the second year that we used to tag onto bats that stayed on for weeks at a time. But we didn't use any like stitching or things like that because we wanted the transmitters to be able to fall off when they were no longer working.
Okay, those Germans, they've always got the best of everything. Hey, best glue,
They
best.
really do.
My husband's German, and he always tells me this. So, Carol's wondering if you know about any new research regarding white nose fungus. You alluded to it a little bit with in your presentation, but do you happen to know kind of the status of it these days?
Yeah, I would say the status of research, there's still a lot of ongoing research happening. I published my paper in the Journal of North American Bat Research, and there are a lot of papers coming out sort of regarding winter activity, also ways that we can combat white nose syndrome in terms of vaccinations, UV exposure, things like that. And there's also a lot of work happening with acoustic work and sort of less invasive techniques of studying bats where we can better understand where they're hibernating, if they're waking up during the winter, potentially due to white nose. Effects and things like that by studying them throughout the winter as well as during the summer. So there's a lot of current work going on. Um, while it still is very much a big pressure that these bats are facing, I will say that promoting habitat, better protecting and preserving roosts that they are in is a really great way to ensure that they're not facing additional pressures like habitat loss.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to let all of our attendees know that we have been recording today's webinar. I had a little hiccup at the beginning where I accidentally hit the wrong one, but I will be getting it online this evening or tomorrow morning, so you're welcome to share that too. Um, and I know we're running out of time here, Emma, but we've had a ton of comments come in about how much people have enjoyed the presentation and the conversation. So I just wanted to share a few of these with you. So Isabel says, it's so interesting to hear all about your research, incredible effort. You should be so proud of all the roosts you identified and all the bats you successfully tracked. Siobhan says, incredible talk. It's always lovely listening to your research. Penny says, great presentation, and that she sees bats in the summer in late evenings, and I always wondered where they roosted. Um, Again, thank you. Nice presentation. Julia from Grasses National Park says, great presentation. Thank you for sharing your research. BJ says, thank you for the great presentation. It was very informative, and there's still more coming in. So I just wanted to pass it on to you. So thank you, Emma.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone taking the time. It's always really nice to get the chance to talk about bats and have people who are interested in learning about them. So, yeah, really anytime, and feel free to shoot me any emails if anybody has any further questions.
Absolutely. Well, thanks to all of our attendees for catching today's webinar. When you leave, there's a quick 1-minute survey that'll pop up. If you fill it out, it gives us some ideas for presentation topics for the future. It also gives us data to report back to our funders so we can keep our speaker series going. So even if you're an ordinary woman with big dreams, we want to hear from you. And I've definitely seen that on the evaluations. So thank you so much, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you at our next Native Prairie speaker series in January about long-billed curlews. And thank you again, Emma, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Bye now.